Hello everyone. Over the past year and a bit, I've been learning Thai solely with comprehensible input videos and online live comprehensible lessons, and I wanted to talk about my experience thus far. I haven't been putting a lot of time into it. I've only averaged a little over an hour a day, so I probably haven't made as much progress as you might expect from a 1-year update video. But I mainly wanted to make this video to talk a bit about how I've been learning, why I decided to learn this way, as well as go through some troubles I've had and mistakes I made, and how I've managed to remedy them. I'll also compare my experience learning Thai to how I learnt Japanese, which is my most proficient, well only proficient, foreign language, and which I learnt with a much more reading heavy approach, at least in the beginning. So first I'll explain how I've been learning and what resources I've been using to learn. The main resource I was using until January this year is the Comprehensible Thai YouTube channel. This contains hundreds of hours of comprehensible input videos in Thai, and it's divided into different levels that become incrementally harder as you watch them in order, all the way from complete beginner content to intermediate and beyond. The idea is that you use these videos to acquire the base of the language, after which you can move on to native material and go from there. On top of that, for the last few months, I've been doing online comprehensible input classes. I usually try and do 2 50-minute classes with ALG Thai online during weekdays, and 1 lesson each with a different teacher on Saturdays and Sundays. This has replaced the videos as my main source of input over the past few months. None of this involves any sort of traditional study. No grammar, no vocab study, no learning the script, no taking notes, no memorization, just sitting back and watching. This only works for learning a language if the input you're getting is comprehensible, that is, understandable. The teachers use pictures and gestures to give you an idea of what they're talking about, even if you don't understand any words yet. If you understand the message, even if you don't understand the words, then you'll end up picking up the language naturally with hundreds of hours of this type of content. You can't learn a language just by listening to the radio or watching lots of TV. Even children can't. It needs to be comprehensible. Not only that, but I'm actively trying not to think about the language or take mental notes while listening, but instead I try to switch off the analytical part of my mind and focus on the message and the overall experience rather than the words and intricacies of the language. I won't go into the reasons why I decided to learn Thai. I'll leave that for another video, but I would like to briefly talk about why I decided to learn Thai in this specific way. Firstly, I want to demonstrate the power of input. I feel as if even many immersion learners hold traditional language study to be far more important than it actually is, and input is treated as something that's only really effective when combined with traditional study. I still often hear serious people claim that adults have to study because they lose the ability to learn naturally like children. I would like to be just one example that shows this is false, and I certainly won't be the first. I'm not necessarily saying that this is the most efficient way, but I want to at least demonstrate that deliberate study isn't necessary as long as you have comprehensible input. As well as that, I expect to gain many insights into the language learning process, which I can then share with others on this channel and hopefully give better advice. The second and perhaps somewhat more controversial reason is that I want to acquire the language without thinking about it or expending any sort of mental effort except what is required to keep focused on whatever I'm watching. This goes beyond avoiding study and memorization of the language. It also means that when I'm consuming input, I try my best not to notice or think about the characteristics of the language, such as sentence structure, the phonemes and sounds, etc. Instead, I just try to ignore those aspects of the language and understand what I can from the pictures, body language, and the words I can already recognize without conscious recall. After years of learning Japanese primarily through input, I noticed a massive leap in my ability to understand the language when I stopped trying so hard to analyze what I was hearing and started trying to listen to it in a similar way I would listen to my native language, just focusing on the meaning without trying to think about the language itself. Shortly thereafter, I discovered the ALG method for learning languages, which I'm currently using to learn Thai, and that essentially put into words what I had already begun to suspect based on my own experience. That minimizing deliberate study and conscious analysis can lead to a more natural and effortless command of the language in the long run. I'm still skeptical of some of the claims of ALG theory, but this is one that made a lot of sense to me based on my own experience, and it's one that I wanted to test out. I have some ideas about why I think it might be better not to think about the language when immersing, but it's too much to cover here, so I plan to make a separate video about that. As I said before, when listening to the language, the ideal is to focus purely on the meaning without thinking about the language. But whether that's possible to do 100% is a different matter, and I'll briefly touch upon this later in the video. On the Comprehensible Thai channel, beginner content is divided into 5 different levels: B0, B1, B2, B3, and B4, each one increasing in difficulty. And altogether, I believe there's around 500 hours worth of beginner content, which is followed by roughly another 500 hours of intermediate content. I actually had 2 brief attempts at learning Thai this way back in 2022 and 2023. I ended up reaching near the end of the B1 playlist. When I started again in April 2024, I decided to start where I'd left off. I'm currently about halfway through the last beginner playlist, B4, and I've been there for the last few months because I've mainly been doing online lessons for the past few months, and this has mostly replaced the time I was using to watch the videos previously, so I haven't progressed much through the videos these past few months. I've managed to pick up many of the most common words and phrases. It's impossible to know how many words I can recognize, but I'd guess it's a few hundred at the very least. Most of the words you pick up first are the names of objects and things, countries, colors, numbers, foods, etc., as well as plenty of other common verbs and adjectives. I've had so many experiences when I realize I know the meaning of a word upon hearing it, even though I never actually paid attention to it. My subconscious mind just acquired it without my knowing. Because the teachers tend to do certain gestures or use pictures for certain words or phrases, you naturally start to associate that sound with that visual without having to think. This feels like it leads to a much more vivid understanding of those words or sentences, because you actually associate it with a visual experience rather than a translation or explanation of the meaning. I've also had experiences where I've heard a sentence and although I didn't consciously recognize any of the words, somehow I just knew what was being said upon hearing it. There are also plenty of words and phrases I've noticed because I've heard them so many times, but I still don't know the meaning of them. This usually takes care of itself eventually with enough exposure in different contexts, I've noticed. Another thing I like about learning with comprehensible input this way is you get exposure to certain words that native children would definitely learn, but that are generally harder to acquire just from native content. I've picked up certain words for example, animals or everyday objects in Thai that I might not know in Japanese even after more than 7 years of learning. Of course, at just over 500 hours, I still can't understand native content, but just the other day I clicked on a video made for Thai natives that came up in my YouTube recommendations, and I was pleased to discover I could consistently recognize words that I knew, and I could even pick up the occasional short sentence. This tells me it's working well enough. I feel like at this point I've managed to build a decent foundation in the very basics of the language. It's certainly a slow process, but that's the reality of learning an Asian language that has absolutely no structural similarities to English. And it's a very rewarding experience growing your comprehension and realizing you've essentially absorbed a good deal of the language just by watching videos. I'm confident that with a few thousand hours of learning, I'll be well on my way to effortlessly understanding the language. But it hasn't all been smooth sailing. From the start, I've made plenty of mistakes in my approach to learning Thai, and I've been through plenty of rough patches throughout the year. I'll go through them all, and I'd recommend others learning a language with comprehensible input to try to avoid these mistakes from the beginning. The first mistake I made was not starting again with easier videos. Before I started learning Thai again, a little over a year ago in 2024, I'd already made 2 previous attempts in 2022 and 2023, during which I'd managed to get through most of the B1 playlist. When I started over in 2024, I should have gone back to the start of the playlist, but instead I carried on from where I'd left off over a year prior, at the end of the B1 playlist, despite having lost a good deal of what I'd learnt because I hadn't been exposed to the language for over a year. This means I struggled a bit with comprehension in some of the videos, especially as they continued to increase in difficulty. One major trouble I had is lack of focus. I often struggled to prevent my mind from wandering as I watched the videos. There were a few factors that contributed to my lack of focus. For a start, because I was impatient and intent on getting through the beginner stage as quickly as possible, I basically set a daily quota for myself and would force myself to continue watching even after I'd become bored and lost concentration. Learning is much more enjoyable and easier to focus on when you treat it as a leisurely stroll rather than a sprint. Life circumstances and my mental state played a role in my lack of concentration too. 2024 was a rather turbulent year in my life, and at the end of May, about 6 weeks into learning, in particular was when it took a turn for the worse. I couldn't sleep properly and was altogether under a lot of mental pressure. Up until that point, I remember I was able to keep focus and follow along well enough, but that all changed very suddenly. I've managed to recover now, but looking back, the state I was in certainly hindered my progression. I've really learnt just how important adequate rest and your mental state is while learning, because I've had experiences where I'm watching something and understand practically nothing, and then I'll come back the next day in a relaxed state and after a good night's sleep, and suddenly I can understand it perfectly fine. Another major contributor to my lack of focus is the fact that passively watching content just isn't nearly as engaging as actual human interaction. This was a major problem I had with Japanese too. That's why I started paying for online lessons for Thai. It's much more interactive and engaging, which makes it easier to keep focus. The final problem I experience is overthinking. I mentioned before that I'm attempting to learn without thinking about the language. But realistically, as an adult, it's incredibly difficult to switch off the analytical part of your mind completely. There have been times when I've managed to do it, but I still often catch myself consciously observing certain aspects of the language, certain sounds or the meaning of certain words, for example. But compared to when I was learning Japanese, it's to an incredibly smaller degree. Somewhat counterintuitively, I've noticed that the less I think about the language, the more I actually understand what's being said. As with focus, I've noticed sleep and mental state have a massive impact on my ability to listen without conscious interference. I find when I'm relaxed and well rested, it's much easier to switch off my mind and follow along without focusing on the details. So for the meantime, I plan to maintain a steady, if somewhat slow, pace. With the amount I'm doing per day, I realize it's going to take a long time to actually get anywhere. But I'm in no particular rush at the moment, as I don't have any plans to move back to Thailand anytime soon. Once I'm able to follow along to audio content without the need for visuals, I plan to increase the amount of input I get each day by listening to podcasts and the radio, which is similar to what I did with Japanese. I also intend to eventually start doing crosstalk with native speakers, which is a method of conversation in which each person speaks his own native language. My current goal is to be able to use the spoken language in daily life without any problems. Once I reach that point, I'll decide whether I want to take it any further. There's a lot more I'd like to talk about, but I'll leave it here for the time being. I hope to make another video about my progress sometime soon. If you have any questions or thoughts, be sure to leave me a comment. Thanks for watching.